What would you do if the sun simply vanished one day in June? Not in an eclipse, not for a night, but slowly dimmed day after day until the summer heat became a distant memory. Imagine the smell, not of fresh-cut grass, but the scent of damp earth and rot in the middle of July, because the rain hasn't stopped for weeks and the fields are drowning under a gray sky. Feel the cold, a piercing chill that sinks into your bones as you watch. In disbelief, snowflakes fall upon your corn crops. Look at them, now just black, frozen stalks, ghosts of a harvest that will never be. Listen to the silence, an unnatural quiet that has fallen over the countryside. There are no birds singing. They have dropped dead from the tree branches, frozen, tiny specks of life extinguished by an out-of-season winter. Behold the sky. By day, it is a strange, sickly yellowish color, and at sunset, it ignites in a blood red so intense, so violent, it seems to herald the end of all days. This is not an apocalyptic novel. For millions of people in 1816, this was their daily life. This was the terrifying reality of the year without a summer. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a climate disaster. It is the intimate tale of human survival in a world that froze, the testimony of how darkness can, paradoxically, give birth to the most unexpected creation. To understand the magnitude of the catastrophe, you must first walk through the world that received it. An exhausted, fragile world, still licking its wounds. It was 1816. Barely a year before, the thunder of cannons at Waterloo had brought a bloody end to the Napoleonic Wars. Europe was a continent of scars, with nations indebted to their very souls and populations decimated by more than 2 decades of ceaseless conflict. Grain reserves were at historic lows. The fields, abandoned by the soldiers now returning home, were only just beginning to be tilled again. There was a tense peace, the exhausted silence that follows a storm that has raged for too long. Across the ocean, the young United States was expanding westward, driven by an optimism that would soon prove as fragile as glass. But in both worlds, one reality united almost everyone: the land. 9 out of 10 people lived and died by the rhythm of the seasons. Their existence depended directly on what the earth produced. There were no social safety nets, no large-scale government aid. If the harvest failed, the only option was starvation. Communication was a slow whisper, bound to the speed of a horse or a sailing ship. News took weeks, sometimes months, to cross a country or an ocean. So when the sky began to darken, when the cold refused to leave, no one understood why. Fear and superstition filled the void left by science. There was talk of God's wrath, a punishment for the sins of war. Others, looking at the sun through the haze, claimed to see spots on its surface, omens of an age of darkness. It is on this stage, a world brought to its knees by war, and utterly dependent on a sun it took for granted, that an event 12,000 kilometers away was about to unleash hell. An event of which no one in Europe or America had the slightest inkling. The cause of it all, the origin of the darkness, was born in an inferno of fire and rock. It was the most violent eruption in recorded history, the cataclysmic explosion of Mount Tambora on the distant island of Sumbawa in modern-day Indonesia in April of 1815. Imagine the sound, a roar so colossal, it was mistaken for cannon fire more than 2,000 kilometers away. A detonation that shattered the air and announced that the earth itself was tearing apart. Feel the ground tremble beneath your feet as a column of ash, smoke, and pulverized rock soars 43 kilometers into the sky, piercing the atmosphere. The entire region was plunged into absolute darkness for days, a midday as black as the deepest night. Then came the rain, not of water, but of fist-sized pumice stones, hailing from the dark sky to crush roofs and skulls alike. Entire villages were incinerated in an instant by pyroclastic flows, rivers of 800-degree gas and ash that wiped 12,000 souls off the map before they could even scream. A tsunami, born from the mountain's collapse, swept the shores of neighboring islands, claiming tens of thousands more. But Tambora's true weapon was not its lava or its immediate fury. It was an invisible poison it hurled into the sky, millions of tons of sulfur dioxide. This gas was injected directly into the stratosphere, far above the clouds and rain, where chemical reactions transformed it into a global veil of sulfate aerosols. Slowly, silently, this veil began to spread across the globe, carried by stratospheric winds. It was a ghostly mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space. And below, on the surface, the planet's temperature began to drop. For the people of Sumbawa, it was the apocalypse. Entire kingdoms were annihilated, their people, and culture turned to ash. For the rest of the world, the cause was invisible, unknown, a phantom in the atmosphere. They noticed only its effects. The skies began to change color, yielding sunsets of spectacular and terrifying beauty, which the painter J.M.W. Turner would capture on his canvases, never knowing he was painting the funeral of summer. To grasp the scale of what Tambora unleashed, we must step back for a moment. Scientists call this phenomenon volcanic winter. It is measured on a scale called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI, which runs from 0 to 8. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which many remember, was a VEI 5. The famous 1883 explosion of Krakatoa, which altered the world's climate, was a VEI 6, 10 times more powerful. The eruption of Tambora was a VEI 7, 100 times more powerful than St. Helens, 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa. It was the only eruption of this magnitude in the last 1,000 years. And to make matters worse, this planetary blow occurred during a period of low solar activity known as the Dalton minimum. The sun was already in a cooler phase. Tambora's veil not only blocked the heat, but it did so when the world could least afford it. It was the perfect storm. In 1816, that ghostly veil arrived in full force over North America. The young nation's optimism was about to be frozen solid. Imagine being a farmer in New England. It's June. You're expecting warmth and sun. Instead, you wake up to a blanket of snow covering your newly planted sprouts. In Albany, New York, heavy, wet snow falls on a landscape that should be green and vibrant. It's July, the heart of summer. But in Pennsylvania, lakes and ponds are found covered in a half-centimeter thick layer of ice at dawn. It's August, the month of the harvest. But in Vermont, every morning a killing frost burns the leaves of the corn and potatoes, leaving the fields black and lifeless. Every night, the battle for survival is lost. The very air feels strange. Persistent dry fog refuses to dissipate. It irritates the eyes, scratches the throat, and carries with it a faint but unmistakable smell of sulfur. On the streets of Quebec, birds, confused and weakened by the relentless cold, simply drop dead from the trees. The agrarian economy, the pillar of society, collapsed. The price of oats, the fuel for horses, multiplied eightfold. Hay for livestock became more valuable than grain for people. Many farmers, facing the impossible choice of feeding their families or their animals, were forced to slaughter their livestock, killing their own future. A grim nickname spread throughout the region, a saying that summarized the collective trauma: 1,800 and froze to death. Listen to the voice of Hannah Dawes Newcomb, writing in her diary in Keene, New Hampshire. The weather continues very cold. All nature seems to be clad in gloom. There seems to be no prospect of there being food enough for man or beast. For thousands of families, the choice was brutal: stay and starve, or abandon everything they knew. They left behind their farms, their homes, the graves of their ancestors. This was not a migration, it was a flight. A massive wave of desperate people began moving west, towards Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, in search of a sun that no longer shone in the east. The year without a summer redrew the demographic map of America. If America froze, Europe drowned. The continent, just beginning to heal from war, was struck by an even greater catastrophe: famine. Imagine a world without color, perpetually gray. In Switzerland, it rained for 132 consecutive days. Rivers like the Rhine became monsters of mud and water, overflowing their banks and devouring towns and cities. In Ireland, the torrential rains never ceased. The potato crop, the sole sustenance for millions, rotted in the waterlogged earth. The famine that followed was one of the worst in its history, bringing with it a twin sister, a typhus epidemic that spread like wildfire through the weakened population. The sky was a constant oppressor, a leaden vault crushing the spirit. The crop failure was continental. From France to Hungary, from Italy to Great Britain, the fields produced nothing. This was not a shortage, it was a void. And in that void, food prices soared to unsustainable levels. Bread, the staff of life, became an unattainable luxury. Governments, their coffers emptied by war, had no answer. They could not import grain that did not exist. They could not distribute aid they did not have. The climate crisis transformed, almost overnight, into a total social collapse. Desperation spilled onto the streets in the form of fury. In England, starving crowds marched under a banner with a terrifying slogan, "Bread or blood." In France, grain convoys needed military escorts to protect them from bands of desperate people who would attack to plunder a single sack of flour. Listen to the words of the poet Percy Shelley, writing from Geneva. "The state of the peasantry here is deplorable. The magistrates have forbidden the making of white bread. All classes of people are in the greatest distress. The year without a summer was just the beginning." The next, 1817, would be remembered across Europe as the Year of the Beggar. But not everyone suffered equally. While thousands starved in the fields and cities, the aristocracy and the wealthy elite took refuge in their grand estates, protected by stone, walls, and food reserves. The crisis exposed the fractures of society with brutal cruelty. In Switzerland, the situation became so dire that at high society dinner parties, guests were asked to bring their own bread, a gesture that reveals a world disconnected from the agony surrounding it. This contrast, the image of a rich man rationing his white bread while a peasant family boiled weeds to survive, did not go unnoticed. Hunger not only gnawed at stomachs, it also fueled a deep resentment. The crisis was not just climatic, it became a crisis of class. The resentment sown in the empty furrows of 1816 would germinate in the following decades, feeding the fires of the revolutionary movements that would change Europe forever. And yet, paradoxically, the darkest summer in history gave birth to some of the most luminous and terrifying creations of the human imagination. Transport yourself to the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva. It is June 1816. A group of young English friends is trapped inside the mansion by the incessant rain and unnatural cold. They are Lord Byron, the rebellious poet, Percy Shelley, his disciple, the 18-year-old Mary Godwin, the future Mary Shelley, and Byron's personal physician, John Polidori. Imagine the scene. The constant sound of rain lashing against the windows, thunder rumbling between the mountains like the artillery of the gods, lightning flashes that fleetingly illuminate the dark, churning lake, revealing a hostile and alien world. To combat the boredom and the oppressive atmosphere, Byron proposes a challenge, that each of them write a ghost story. In that atmosphere, heavy with apocalyptic premonitions, with the sense that the natural world had turned against humanity, Mary Shelley had a vision, a waking dream, as she called it. She saw a pale student of science kneeling beside the thing he had created, a monstrous creature that was beginning to stir. Thus was born Frankenstein, the modern myth about the hubris of science and the consequences of playing God. Meanwhile, Dr. Polidori, inspired by a fragment from Byron, wrote a story called The Vampire. His creation was not the folkloric monster of the past, but an aristocratic, charming, and deadly predator who moved through the salons of high society. He was the archetype that, decades later, would inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. Listen to Mary's own words in her journal. "An almost perpetual rain confines us principally to the house. One night, we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld. The darkness outside seeped into their minds and gave shape to their monsters. The summer that never was became the cradle of Gothic horror. The crisis did not only birth monsters, it forced humanity to innovate in ways no one could have foreseen, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Return to Europe, to the streets of German cities. The mass death of horses, deprived of the oats that were their fuel, caused the collapse of the primary means of transport. The streets, normally filled with the clatter of hooves and carriages, grew strangely silent. A silence broken only by the sound of heavy cartwheels, now pulled not by beasts, but by desperate men. It was this crisis, the absence of the horse, that inspired a German inventor named Karl von Drais. He became obsessed with creating an alternative, a personal mode of transport that did not need to be fed. In 1817, he presented the world with his Laufmaschine, the running machine. It was a simple vehicle, 2 wheels, a seat, and a handlebar. With no pedals, it was propelled by pushing one's feet against the ground. It was clumsy, it was strange, but it was a revolutionary idea. It was the direct ancestor of the bicycle. The impact of the crisis went further. Governments, terrified by the prospect of total revolution, were forced to create the first rudimentary social aid networks, laying the foundations for the welfare state. Scientists, for the first time, began to seriously study global climate patterns. The year without a summer was a brutal lesson that taught them the world was a single, interconnected system, where a volcano's eruption on a remote island could condemn an entire continent to starvation. It was civilization's rude awakening to its own profound vulnerability. Imagine for one last moment, a farmer in Vermont, standing and staring at his frozen field in the middle of July. A mother in a waterlogged Irish city with nothing to feed her children. And a group of young writers in a Swiss villa creating immortal monsters from the darkness that surrounded them. All of them, separated by thousands of kilometers, by oceans and cultures, were connected by the same invisible cloud of ash, united in their suffering by a volcano whose name they never knew. The story of 1816 is not just about a volcano. It is a profound and chilling reminder of our fragility. It shows us how our world, which we believe to be so solid and predictable, has always been at the mercy of natural forces far greater than ourselves. And it teaches us that even in the deepest darkness, in the most desperate cold, human necessity and creativity find a way not only to survive, but to create something entirely new. If such an event were to happen today, with all our technology and knowledge, do you think we would be better prepared, or would our interdependent global system make us even more vulnerable? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this journey through the year that froze the world has chilled you, subscribe. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.